What is up, night crawlers? Welcome back to the Nightmare's Edge. So before we get started, I just wanted to give another quick thanks to all those that joined me on this epic story. The Dark Somnium, RomNex, As the Raven Dreams, Madam Raven, Creepy Face, Dodge the Grave, Derek Weber Scary Stories, Danny Dreadful, Lady Nopeingham, and Somber Puppet. Again, thank you all so much. You did truly amazing work. Now, without any further ado, please sit back, relax, and let me tickle those inner fears. Some time ago, we set sail from Fort Lauderdale. Our destination was Lagos, Portugal. The estimated trip was about 3 to 4 weeks, assuming everything went smoothly. My wife Hannah and I had spent several months before the trip learning how to sail. We had the time and money to pack up and go, and we'd always wanted to see Lagos. So we decided it was time to put our new skill and sailboat to good use. The first week was exciting. A sense of freedom comes with sailing the open seas, which is funny considering we spent most of our time confined to a 30-foot space. But as we looked out into the endless waters, we couldn't help but feel we had left the world behind and entered a new one. Like we'd left all our expectations and worries in a separate reality. Despite the feeling of liberation, there were still a few bumps in the first week. The wind wasn't as much of a team player as we'd hoped, and the water got a little rough at times, but we managed. By the second week, we were sailing in the middle of the North Atlantic, roughly halfway between Fort Lauderdale and Lagos. That first morning of the new week, I'd gotten out of bed before sunrise, made a cup of coffee, and climbed above deck. That was my morning routine. The water was flat, and there wasn't any wind. It was foggy out. As we floated forward a bit, the sun began to rise. I could see a dark object sticking out of the water. I thought it was a capsized boat. It was somewhat rounded like the underside of a hull. I woke up Hannah and told her to grab some vests and the first aid kit. But as we got closer, I could see that it wasn't a sailboat. It was a mass of rock. Hannah appeared on deck with the rescue gear in hand, a puzzled look on her face as she asked,
"Wait, there are people on that rock?"
"I thought it was a boat." I was as confused as her. Why was there a rock in the middle of the ocean? It's supposed to be thousands of feet deep right here. I steered the ship alongside it and shut off the motor. The rock didn't stick out of the water much. I was able to jump from the sailboat onto its surface without issue, but the surface area was huge, over 5 times that of the boat.
"You think it's some sort of underwater mountain?"
Hannah asked from the boat. I walked along the surface. "Maybe we should go under and look."
I'll grab the goggles.
Hannah hurried below deck. She loved the water. We both did. Any reason to throw goggles on and explore. She was game. She appeared back on deck wearing goggles, a snorkel, and a wetsuit. She lowered the rear ladder and jumped in. I shook my head and smiled. I loved how energetic and curious she always was. She laid face down along the surface of the water, the snorkel sticking up for air. I explored along the top of the rock while she swam around. Then I stopped. There were markings. I knelt for a closer look. These were artificial, symbols of some sort. A language perhaps. It looked almost like runes, ancient Viking writing. I reached down to touch one of the engravings when Hannah poked her head out of the water.
"You have to see this,"
she said. "Hannah, there are markings on this rock."
"There are markings on that side of it as well."
"The side?"
"Yeah, it's like a giant tower.
"What do you mean?"
It's a big cylinder.
"How far does it go down?" Hannah shrugged.
It's too dark to tell. I think it goes all the way down to the bottom."
I looked back at the rock below my feet. What the hell was this thing? Why hadn't we ever heard of it? Who made these marks? Has everyone else sailed past this giant rock without noticing it? "Come up here," I said. Hannah swam to the boat and climbed up the ladder.
"Those markings look ancient,"
she said as she took off the snorkel and goggles and tossed them aside. I knelt back down and rubbed my fingers across one. It began to glow an orangish color.
What the fuck?
I said as I stood back up. Hannah was about to jump onto the rock.
What?
Stay there.
I said, holding my hand up to stop her.
Why?
It's glowing.
What is?
All of a sudden, the rock began to vibrate.
Nate!
Hannah said, panicked.
What's going on?
I began to stumble back towards the boat, fearing the worst. Then, a rectangle opening appeared at the edge of the rock. The vibrating came to a halt. We were both speechless. I hesitated a moment and then approached the opening.
Nate, don't!
Said Hannah.
I just want to look real quick.
I don't like this.
That should have been my first hint, as curious and adventurous as Hannah was. But I couldn't resist at least taking a quick peek. I leaned over the opening and looked inside.
There are stairs,
I said.
Nate, come back.
Against my better judgment, I stepped into the opening. I could see that the stone stairs descended in a wide spiral.
Toss me a flashlight.
I hollered to Hannah.
Nate.
Just do it.
I snapped at her. She huffed and went below deck. I hate that I raised my voice at her. I hardly ever do. But this was too incredible. It could be the most significant discovery in centuries, maybe ever. She returned to the deck and tossed me the light. I turned it on and leaned into the stairwell, trying to see as much as I could. I climbed down a step, not thinking. My curiosity was steering me. Another step.
Nate!
I heard her call my name but continued anyway. Another step.
Nate, stop!
Another step. And then another. And then the rock began to shake again. The opening was beginning to seal shut. I hurried back towards the top. Hannah cried out my name. That was the last time I heard her. It closed before I could get out.
Hannah!
I yelled for her.
Hannah!
No answer.
Touch the center mark!
Still, no response. I stood at the top of the stairs for several minutes, listening for her, for any sign she was trying to get me out, but could not hear anything. I didn't want to leave in case Hannah was able to figure out how to open the door, but my curiosity was still there. I shined the light down the stairs. I took a deep breath and descended. Soon, the darkness faded as the stairwell opened up to a large cylindrical room. Lights flickered from a flame-lit chandelier made of what appeared to be iron. Its design looked medieval or older. In the center of the room was a large wooden podium. A thick leather book lay open atop it. I moved over to it and looked. Somebody had written onto the page symbols like those I'd seen on the rock. I touched the pages, old and worn. I felt like turning a page would cause it to crumble. As if in response to my touch, the writing began to change. The words shifted and faded around the page until they were in English. He waits upon his throne of blood and bone, within the tower of ancient stone. I backed away from the book. My curiosity waned and fear was now coursing through me. I needed to get out. I was confident that what awaited me was something sinister, something evil. I began to feel its presence in the air. Then, as if on cue, it spoke to me. A whisper, like a passing wind, said,
Come to me.
I did not move, nor could I gather the words to speak. My heart was drumming inside my chest. I glanced over once more. Why hadn't Hannah figured out how to open the door yet? She was no dummy. She saw where I was standing when the rock began to vibrate. She heard me say the mark was glowing, so why was I still trapped inside? Then the thought occurred to me. Maybe the door wouldn't open for her. Maybe going down was my only option. I stepped over to the winding stone stairs and peered down. Hannah had said the tower looked as if it continued to the bottom of the ocean, thousands of feet. I wondered how much of that I would have to walk. How long would it take? And what awaited me below? I took a moment to steady my breath. and continued my descent. Down the ancient stone steps of the dark, damp tower, I descended into the unknown. It was quiet. There weren't any sounds to give me a clue as to what would come next. But as I slunk down the steps, I saw that the stairwell was opening up to another large circular room. It did not have an iron chandelier like the room above, but rather a series of lit torches positioned along the wall. And in the center of the room, a man. He was sitting nude in a simple wooden chair. His hair was long and gray with a beard to match. He was bone thin and with skin as pale as the moon. It was as if he hadn't seen the sun in years, maybe ever.
Hello?
I said as I made my way down the steps. He did not answer. I considered proceeding past him, but immediately saw that the remaining stairs were shut off with a large wooden door, with neither knobs nor handles. The only hint I had that the door opened was the keyhole. I glanced over to the man to double check that he had not moved, and then stole a glance through the keyhole. More stairs. I turned my attention back to the man, realizing that if I were to continue any further, he was likely my only hope.
Excuse me.
I inched closer to him. He maintained his forward gaze without moving or speaking. I began to worry that he wasn't even breathing.
Sir?
I said again.
Can you help me?
Still, no response. I leaned next to him.
I need to get out of this tower.
He twisted his head in my direction, and as he did so, I could hear the clicks and pops from his scarcely used joints. He did not look at me so much as faced me, and I soon recognized the cloudy gray of his eyes like those of a blind man. He parted his lips as if to speak, but let out only a dry wheeze. His vocal cords became more dormant and weak over time. Eventually, he was able to utter the words,
"He awaits upon the throne of blood and bone, within the tower of ancient stone."
the same lines I had read in the book upstairs.
Who is he?
I asked. The old man did not react, and after a moment, repeated the same lines.
Yes,
I said, growing impatient.
but who is he?
Once again, he repeated the words from the book. I'd become frustrated. I raised my voice and finally asked,
How do I get to him then?
The man rose from the chair, shaky and frail, joints popping. He lifted a necklace over his head that his long beard had covered. From the leather string dangled a large iron key. Hunched over, and with great difficulty, the man staggered to the door and inserted the key into the lock. There was an exchange of noises that echoed through the room as he turned the key. The heavy door drifted open on its own, as if some invisible force opened it. The man hung the string back around his neck and receded to his chair. I leaned into the stairwell.
What's down there?
I asked, but the man reverted to his unflinching silence. I readied myself and continued my descent. As I tread further down the stairs, I could see that I was entering into another flame-lit space. The air felt thick and had a copper-like odor. I could hear what sounded like low moaning. I steadied myself against the dark stone wall and felt wetness beneath my hand. I recoiled, and below the flickering light of the overhead torch, I saw that my fingers and palm were red. I gasped. The wall was coated in blood, as if the stones themselves were sweating it. But then I noticed something. There were drops of blood on my skin, on my clothes, and as I touched my clean hand to my face, my fingertips came away smeared with red. There was a lingering mist of blood in the air. My heart began to race. What was this? No single living thing bleeds enough to fill the air. Maybe it isn't blood, I thought. But it smelled like blood, it looked like blood, and as the stairwells opened up to the next room, my fears were confirmed. It was blood. This was not a room like the others. This was a massive chamber, hundreds of feet deep. The stairs spiraled wide and open along the walls, down into a dark pit. Suspended from chains and shackles with their wrists above their heads, were 4 people spaced evenly apart. Extending from their slit open and bloodied abdomens were their intestines, stretched to the limit and tied together in a raw, meaty knot. Their legs appeared freshly amputated, and from their gaping wounds, blood flowed.
Dear God,
I said. I'd never seen anything so disturbing, so gruesome, so hellish. Was I in hell? The blood rained down into a dark void that my flashlight could not penetrate. I did not want to continue any further. There could be nothing good awaiting me. These were fresh bodies, fresh victims. I might be next. I decided to turn around, to hurry to the top and hope that Hannah would eventually open the stone hatch. I'd wait all week if I had to. But as I returned to the large wooden door, I saw that it was closed. This side did not have any doors or handles either. I pounded my fist against the door.
let me in!
I yelled. No answer, no movement that I could hear, nothing. I pounded on the door until my arms ached and my hands were sore.
Please!
I began to weep. I should have listened to Hannah. God, what I would have given to be back on the surface with her, holding her, apologizing for being so stubborn, telling her I'd never doubt her again. I wanted that. I needed that. I reluctantly turned from the door and headed back down the steps. I was feeling squeamish and drained of hope. Then I heard it again, a pained moan. I'd forgotten about it earlier when faced with the gruesome sight. I moved down the steps a little more quickly. Who was crying? It sounded like more than one person. I was back out in the open. I focused on the chain nightmare hanging in the center of the chamber, and then I saw it. One of them let out a tormented groan. Then another raised his head, his face contorted in agony. They were alive. I wanted to call out to them, but what good would it do? I couldn't help them, and they weren't in any condition to help me. I averted my gaze, feeling powerless and unsettled, and continued hesitantly down the slick stone steps. I forced the image out of my head and thought of Hannah's tender smile instead.
I will return to you,
I said under my breath. Confidence began to return to me. It warmed my blood and fortified my soul. I was getting out of that tower one way or another. The devil himself couldn't stop me from returning to the woman I love. If I had to, I'd knock down the gates of hell to be with Hannah again. My posture straightened. I clenched my fist and with a newfound eagerness descended into the darkness. And that's when I slipped. I had put my weight down on a particularly slimy part of the stairs, and my foot shot forward, sending me tumbling down the wet stairway. To my right was walled and solid, but to the left was open and a straight drop into the dark. I did not know how far of a fall or what was at the bottom. I bounced and rolled, ramming into the wall and sliding towards the edge. There was nothing to grab a hold of, nothing dry enough for me to even press into. I tried to regain my balance, but I was tumbling too quickly. I was taking a beating, and although I wasn't thinking and trying to survive instead, part of me knew I'd be in rough shape regardless if I lived or died. I picked up quite a bit of momentum when I hit the wall one last time, and did so with enough force that it propelled me backwards and over the edge. My fear had become a reality. I was plummeting to my death, I realized, but the thought was brief. My body splashed into a puddle and landed hard against the solid ground. The air was heaved from my lungs, leaving me wide-eyed and gasping. My body tensed against the wet ground. I lived through the fall, but my breath had escaped, and I was worried that it wouldn't return. Then, as if a seal had been torn away from my mouth, I gulped in a surge of wet, metallic air. I coughed, not sure whether I was choking on my blood or someone else's, or both. The spasms died down, and my breathing became steady as I sat up. The throbbing in my ears slowed. I was in pitch black. I knew I was sitting in an almost ankle-high puddle of what was undoubtedly blood. I could hear the dripping that came from the mutilated bodies overhead, but there was another noise, heavier, sloshing in the puddle and occasionally patter, and then more sloshing. Finally, a potent splash sent a spray of droplets in my direction. Something was in there with me. I waded through the blood, a blind and desperate search for my flashlight. Where was it? Could it be on the stairs? My fingers brushed against a solid object. I gripped it and spun around. I clicked it on towards the noise. The blood-soaked lens bathed them in red light. Drenched head to toe were 3 women dancing beneath a shower of blood, stirring up waves and the gore around them. They moved with ecstasy, tossing their crimsoned hair back to let the blood wash over their faces. They were unfazed by my light, entranced in the moment like a group possessed. The fuck was happening? I aimed the light around the room, looking for a door. There wasn't one. Solid wall all the way around. I wondered if this was the bottom. But then I noticed something. The blood was moving along my ankles, draining, slowly. I shined the light on it and realized it was moving like how you might see in a bathtub or a sink, to the center, between the sanguine dancers. I stepped towards them, tracing the slow-moving current of the blood. At their feet, I saw what looked like a sewer lid. It had some holes that the blood was draining through, holes that I could use to stick my fingers through and lift the lid. I held my breath and slid between the dancing women. Suddenly, their dance changed. They linked hands and encircled me. They began to let out a bone-chilling laugh as they skipped around me, counterclockwise like children playing Ring Around the Rosie. I lifted the heavy lid and pushed it aside, anxious to leave the frightening scene behind. There was a ladder. I stepped down, the women still snickering around in circles. The ladder was, of course, very slippery from all the blood that had seeped down. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it into the dark below. Nothing. I began to descend and all of a sudden lost my footing. My heart skipped a beat and I hooked my arm onto the ladder at the last second, dropping the flashlight in the process. It rattled off a metal rung and I watched as it fell, becoming a distant speck swallowed by the dark. I had a long way to go. To descend a ladder into utter darkness, one must move tedious and measuredly. A single wrong step might have caused me to plunge deep into further blackness. I did not know what awaited me at the bottom. There was no way for me to find out exactly how much time had passed, but I could feel that it had been hours. My slow descent was reduced even further by soreness and fatigue. My body ached all over. There was an odor, the copper-like smell of blood mixed with a rotting putridity. It had been present throughout my climb down the ladder. It gnawed at my head and made focusing difficult. Blood rained past me from above. How did they bleed so much? I heard the dripping of liquid joining more liquid. My body was ready to give out when I felt the legs submerge into something warm and wet. Water would have been a welcome change, but I knew better. More blood. I hesitated a moment. I still lacked all visibility. I would be treading blindly through the blood. I peered up the ladder, but the manhole cover had been resealed hours ago. I took a deep breath and stepped off the ladder. My feet were unable to reach the bottom of the blood-filled pool. I kicked and paddled with great effort to keep my head above the gore. Blood is thicker than water. I knew that my best bet was to stay against the wall and follow it, and hope that it would lead me to a door or some other way out. I pressed my hand against the slimy stone and swam. I hadn't got far when I saw a lantern flicker to life at the opposite end of the chamber. In its faint glow, I could see a wooden rowboat. The blood rippled as the oars were pushed and pulled, propelling the boat towards me.
Hello?
I called out. The boat continued in my direction. I was hesitant to find out who was steering, but what choice did I have? The boat reached me, and I could see a shadowy figure on board. He wore a dark, ragged coat with the hood over his head. Shadows concealed his face. He leaned towards me and extended his arms.
Take my hand,
He said. His voice was aged but still had some strength to it. I was slick with blood. I would not be easy to grip. I did as he had said, and to my surprise, he grabbed a hold of my hand and hauled me out of the blood into the boat. I was a crimson sheen under the glimmer of the lantern. The man grabbed the lantern and sat in front of me. He set the lantern down between us and lowered his hood. He had long, unwashed white hair and a long beard. Like the man who had opened the door for me earlier, he was elderly, but not as skeletal as the other man. I could see that he was missing his right eye.
Thank you.
I said. The older man nodded.
What is this tower?
I asked.
A prison, mostly. This chamber is my cell.
How long have you been down here?
I do not know.
Why are you here?
I was captured.
The old man smirked and grabbed a hold of the oars and began to row us back to the side he'd came from.
Have you tried to escape?
The old man exhaled.
There is no use. We've been deprived of that which gives us our strength.
We?
My people, my family, they are imprisoned here as well.
I thought back to the 4 tortured souls above. Their intestines pulled from their bodies and blood pouring from their amputated legs.
Are you aware of the cruelty that is taking place above?
The old man nodded.
This pool of blood is theirs.
How many people have bled to fill a pool this deep?
The old man stopped rowing. We had reached the other side.
The 4 men you saw hanging have always been, ever since we've been here. They are mutilated, hung from chains, and when their bodies run dry, they are brought down and healed. Then, the cycle repeats.
Healed by who? The 3 women?
The old man nodded.
Yerd, Verdandi, and Skuld, they shape destiny. That of the 4 men above has become a circle of blood and agony.
Those names sound Nordic.
I suddenly remembered the symbols I'd seen on the surface of the tower. They had looked like Viking runes. The old man produced a weary smile.
Yes.
He took hold of the lantern and rose to his feet. He stepped off the boat onto a stone platform and held out his hand for me to follow. Next to the platform was another large wooden door. This one was solid, no keyhole.
I am not able to open this door, but you are,
said the old man.
Why me?
He calls for you.
What does he want?
I do not know.
Who is he?
The prophets spoke of him as if he were the coming days of oblivion. We were ignorant of the truth, that he lives and breathes.
I don't understand.
You will.
The old man motioned at the door.
Place your hands upon the door and it will open.
I did as he told me. There was a sequence of clicks and thumps as the door unlocked, and then slowly but surely, it drifted open. A breath of wind swept against me, and the whispering breath of the one who waits again said,
Come to me.
I turned to the old man.
The door is open. You can join me.
The old man shook his head.
I'm sorry. It is too great a risk. But perhaps you can help us.
How?
Find Aiden. She holds the key.
The key to what?
To ending this.
I looked back at the open door and the descending stone stairs beyond. The old man placed a hand on my shoulder and said,
My sons are down there. I have not seen them in a very long time.
What are their names?
The old man had removed his hand from my shoulder and was returning to the rowboat.
I recognize you.
He said,
We've never met before.
The old man took a seat in the boat and raised his hood back over his head. Another round of blood began to flow down the ladder and into the pool. The dripping echoed off the chamber walls. The old man glanced toward the sound. He looked back at me and smiled.
Not as you are, but as you once were.
The old man extinguished the lantern's flame, casting behind him a curtain of darkness.
What does that mean?
I asked. I could hear the movement of oars and the stirring of the blood. I asked once more, but the man did not respond. I stood at the door and peered down the long, winding stairwell. I could hear what sounded like the distant clang of a hammer striking metal, and towards it I went. Metal on metal. There was a sizzle as the heated piece was submerged into water. My movements were slow and careful. I was oiled head to toe in blood. It dripped from me onto the stone steps. The hammering continued. The sound grew louder as I descended further. The air was becoming warmer. I reached another door, not wooden like the others, but more like an iron prison gate. Still, no knobs or handles. No keyhole. Beyond the gate, I observed a hazy stone chamber lit by a faint reddish glow. A large figure hammered onto a piece that they held steady on the surface of an anvil. Sparks danced around them with each strike as embers escaped from burning coals. I placed my hand on the gate and it creaked open. Another sizzle. I inched closer as the figure drowned the object in a stone tub. The gate drifted shut behind me. Closer, and I could see in the glow a broad-shouldered man dressed in rags, dirty with soot and sweat, hair long like all the others but thinning on top, blondish in color. He brought the object up for air. It dripped red. A blacksmith that cooled his creations in blood. He tossed it onto a pile of similar pieces. I looked around and did not see an obvious way out of the room and down to the next level. I opened my mouth to speak but hesitated. I did not know if this was friend or foe.
I need to get to the next level,
I said. I ditched hello, excuse me, this didn't feel like the type of place for any of those. The hammering halted and the man pivoted to face me. He had a long beard like the rest, something I came to assume was a reflection of how much time they had been imprisoned. He was wild-eyed and looked as if he were both startled and angered by my intrusion.
Who are you?
He grunted. His hammer trembled beneath a white-knuckled grip. I held my hands in front of me to show that I did not mean him harm.
I need to get to the next level.
He raised the hammer and stomped towards me.
I ask you a question.
I flinched and stumbled backward.
Nate, my name is Nate.
Why do you need to get down to the next level?
He asked, his hammer still firmly gripped.
I need to get out of here.
His eyes became less wide and his brow narrowed.
And you think the way out is down?
He lowered his hammer and coughed out a laugh. He turned back to his forge.
There is no way out.
He calls for me.
The man stopped moving. He spun around to face me again.
Then you've chosen to answer his summons?
I'll be trapped in here otherwise.
Do you not fear that a worse fate may await you?
I had considered it. I knew that the one responsible for the nightmare could be nothing less than pure evil. But I needed to understand why he called for me. I needed to know who he was. And most importantly, I needed to try and get back to Hannah, even if that meant traveling to the depths of hell to get my ticket back to the surface. I nodded.
It's a chance I'm willing to take.
The man sighed a low grumble.
Then I wish you luck, Nate.
He returned to his forge and continued his work. I still had unanswered questions. Who was this man? What was he forging? Why was he doing it? And how was I to get to the next level? I moved behind him and peered over his shoulder as he brought the hammer down on the object. He was making the blade of a sword.
Why do you make those?
I asked.
I dream of battle.
He answered as he struck the blade again. Will you use these blades?
It is a cruel punishment for a warrior to be given the means to prepare for a war that he cannot fight.
Then why do it? The man stopped hammering.
Do you not hear it?
We stayed still without moving or speaking. I heard the crackle of the heated coals, the beating of my own heart, the breathing of the powerful figure in front of me. But there were other sounds too, distant, but present nonetheless. Ones that made my blood run cold. Frantic voices of men fighting a losing battle, as others cried out in excruciating agony. The ripping of flesh and the snapping of bones, the metallic clang of fallen blades, and the ravenous snarl of something inhuman.
That beast cannot be bested, not by man. That is their punishment, to fight a losing battle for eternity.
I now understood. He worked the forge to drown out the horrible sound of the endless defeat. But the pile of blades was smaller than one would expect.
Do they use weapons down there?
The prisoner struck the blade with more force.
Yes.
He hit it once again, just as hard.
The weapons that you make.
Sparks flew as the prisoner brought the hammer down on the blade with all of his strength and frustration, causing the head to break free from its wooden handle. His gaze fell to the floor, and his wide shoulders slumped.
Those which I forge are gathered by his demons and given to my people to wield hopelessly.
Why do they continue to fight if there's no hope of winning?
It is all they have.
I wondered why someone so drained of hope wouldn't use the blades he made to kill himself.
Can nobody die in this tower?
Any man cannot kill us, nor can we succumb to age or illness. But of those to whom we were once equal, we are vulnerable. We had always been able to kill each other, some more easily than others. Those days have ended, though, as we are no longer equals. That which made us so has been taken from us. They can kill us, but we cannot do the same to them.
And they choose to resurrect those they kill for the sake of eternal torment?
The prisoner nodded.
I want to help end this,
I said.
You're just a man.
But I can descend the tower freely.
And what is your point?
I will look for a dune.
The prisoner's expression grew somber. His eyes narrowed.
What do you know of Idun?
The man above us said that she holds the key.
The prisoner glanced at the stone ceiling.
What did this man look like?
He was old and gray and missing his right eye.
The prisoner's jaw tensed.
My father.
He exhaled and relaxed a bit.
How is he?
He helped me out of a pool of blood into his rowboat. He spoke of you and your brothers, said he has not seen you in a long time.
The prisoner nodded and changed the topic.
Idun's apples are what gives us our strength and vitality. Without it, we become weak.
I looked at the large, muscular figure in front of me.
You do not look weak.
I am only as strong as a man now.
Other prisoners do not look as healthy as you.
I eat what I am given, and I work the forge. That is the only reason I do not look as they do.
What food are you given?
The prisoner was silent. His eyes flicked towards the floor, but his gaze was distant. I understood.
How do I get to the next level?
I asked. He regained his focus.
There is a door in the floor.
He crossed over to a large stone hatch, barely perceptible aside from the faint outline.
I cannot open it.
I nodded.
I can.
I knelt and placed my palms against the door. It began to vibrate and then slid open, revealing a narrow spiral staircase. I stood up.
I suppose you won't be joining me.
The prisoner smirked.
I wish I could.
I reached out to shake his hand. He gripped mine and pulled me close.
My father is correct about Idun, though her apples do nothing for a man.
He pulled me even closer, seemingly staring into my soul.
But I can see now that you are more.
I did not know what to say. I was just a man trying to get back to his wife. He released me, stepped over to his forge, and then grabbed something and brought it back over. He held out a magnificently crafted sword, one that was different from all the others.
The prophets always said you'd return, but I'd begun to doubt them.
He handed me the sword.
I made this for you long ago.
I took the sword from him, and in my hands, it felt right.
I don't know who you think I am, but thank you,
I said.
Before that blade can be useful, you must find Idun's apples and eat one. Then you will become as you were.
I stepped down the stairs. I could hear the chaos below. I tightened my grip on the sword.
If he summons you, then his beasts and demons will not harm you. But once you eat the apple, they will try,
said the prisoner.
Then why bother eating it?
You must eat the apple if we are to have a chance.
I nodded and continued down the steps. They began to vibrate as the stone hatch started to slide shut above me. I stopped and turned to the prisoner who was still watching me.
Wait,
I said.
What is your name?
He peered down at me through the shrinking gap and at the last moment said,
My name is Thor.
The door slid shut overhead, casting the stairwell into darkness. Had I heard the prisoner correctly? Thor? I shook the nonsense from my head. Maybe his name was Thor, but that didn't mean he was the Norse god, right? I gripped the sword given to me and turned down the narrow, spiraling stairwell. It was dimly lit. I kept my palm pressed against the wall to help guide myself down the dizzying spiral. The chaos from earlier was now quiet. Oddly enough, I found this more concerning. Was the beast waiting for me? Further down the spiral, I began to feel the air of a room well acquainted with death, an environment that had become saturated with pain and desperation, and ultimately, defeat. The sword trembled in my hand. I held it ready as if I were able to use it, but Thor had said that it would be useless until I'd eaten one of Idun's apples. An apple? Had I not already observed the things within the tower, I would have laughed at the notion of an apple being more than fruit. As the stairwell opened to the next chamber, I could see the glint from the lit torches reflecting off puddles of blood. And in those puddles laid mangled bodies, swords littered around them. The chamber had the familiar copper-like odor, but there was another smell, the stink of an unwashed dog. The stairwell was at the center of the room, and I had to step into the chamber to get sight of what was on the other side. I crept out of the stairwell. A crimson puddle splashed around my foot. As if on cue, the mangled corpse began to convulse. Meat and bone shook violently. I stumbled back to the stairwell and watched in horror as limbs began to reattach. The bodies began to shift and rotate, popping and cracking back into place. Spilled organs slid across the stone floor and returned to their fleshy homes. Open wounds resealed. Color returned to the skin of the fallen warriors. The men gasped as their lungs refilled with air. They sat up wide-eyed as if they had woken from a nightmare.
Reality hit them as they scrambled for their blades. There was a heavy gallop, accompanied by the sound of claws clinking on the hard floor. For these men, the nightmare was not over. Bounding past the stairwell was the biggest wolf I'd ever seen. More significant in size than an elephant or a giraffe. Black fur wet with blood. A tail long as a bus. Feet the size of cars. The creature snarled loud as a locomotive, then sunk its fangs into a flailing warrior. With a quick whip of its head, the wolf flung the warrior across the room, crashing him into the stone cylinder that housed the stairwell. The warrior landed at my feet with a wet thud. Dead. About 8 or 9 men were battling the beast, and to my surprise, they were capable of sinking their blades into the animal and causing it pain. But doing so only angered the wolf more. I watched as the wolf ripped 2 warriors to pieces. The sounds of bones breaking and flesh being torn from their bodies was nauseating. I slipped out of the stairwell and to the other side. Another body was thrown past me, hitting the ground and sliding to a stop, face down in a puddle of blood. I scanned the chamber for the next door but could see nothing. I searched the floor for any out-of-the-place creases, but again, found nothing. How was I supposed to get to the next level? Slightly to my left, on the far end of the chamber, there was a shadowed spot that the light did not touch. I leaned towards it and squinted. Something was there. A door? I looked to ensure the wolf was still preoccupied and then sprinted towards the shadow. As I got closer, I realized what it was and stumbled to a halt. In the shadow stood a woman. She had long, black hair draped across her shoulders and to her waist. She was tall and thin and wore a dark gown. Her skin was pale on one side, but her left side looked darker. Maybe it was the shadows, I thought. She held out a hand and beckoned me towards her. With hesitation, I approached while paying attention to my peripheral for the wolf. A chorus of shouting and growling echoed throughout the chamber. I reached the woman and could see why her skin appeared to be 2 different colors. One half was pale flesh, the other was decaying and corpse-like. I immediately staggered backward, fearing I'd fallen into a trap.
"Do not fear me,"
she said. Her voice was calm yet piercing. I could feel it in my bones. Her expression was gloomy and lacked any hint of friendliness, despite her assertion. I held my sword in front of me, ready to swing it at the first sign of hostility. "Who are you?" I asked.
"I will lead you to him.
"Who?"
The one who calls for you."
She stepped aside and gestured at a narrow passageway. Its opening was only about knee-high. "That's the way down?" I asked.
"Yes."
I knelt and could see that the opening immediately hooked to the left upon entry. "Lead the way," I said. I turned to check the wolf's status and could see that he was working on the final warrior. I turned back to the woman. She was gone. "Hello?" I said. I crawled into the narrow opening and looked around the corner. A tight space continued curving downwards and to the left. "Hello?" I shouted, but there was no response. I looked over my shoulder. The wolf was staring at me from across the room, breathing heavily. Its eyes were more than animal, more than human even. Its gaze was penetrating and hungry, yet it did not give the impression that it was craving food, but rather a desire to cause suffering. Blood dripped from its large, snarling mouth. The wolf pointed its nose to the ceiling and let out an ear-splitting howl. The hairs on my arms jumped to attention. I lunged further into the passageway and squeezed around the corner. I kicked off the wall into a desperate crawl. There was barely enough space to move my arms. My back kept pounding against the surface above me. Behind me, I heard the sudden shifting of stone. The howling became muffled as the cramped tunnel was plunged into darkness. Claustrophobia set in. In the pitch black, the small space felt even smaller. The walls seemed as if they were closing in on me. My heart was a pounding drum. I propelled myself forward. My mind was racing. I couldn't breathe. I needed to get out. There wasn't any air. I was suffocating. Then there was a noise, movement. It was behind me. The smacking of hands against the stone surface. 1 slap, 2. The third was further away. 4, 5, 6. Back and forth, near, and then far. It sounded like a dozen people were in there with me. What the hell was happening? I crawled faster. My body was bouncing off every surface. I didn't care. I had to get out. I tried to yell help, but I could only manage a weak murmur. I was panicking. The sword clanged with each desperate move. My mind was spinning. Hurry, you're running out of time, I thought to myself. The tunnel was getting narrower. There wasn't any light up ahead. Where was the end? My heart felt like it was going to explode. The walls were pressing against my shoulders more and more. I shifted to my side. I could feel my eyes pulsating. My ears were ringing. I dragged myself forward with one arm. It was getting narrower. "Fuck!" I yelled. Narrower. I couldn't breathe. The walls were tightening against my back and chest. I pushed with my legs. I was becoming wedged. Another strong push with my legs. A sudden jolt of pain rattled my head as I came to an abrupt halt. It was a dead end. I was trapped. "No, no, please, no," I cried. Something brushed against my feet. I kicked empty air behind me. I pounded the wall with my fists. "Help!" I was losing hope. "Please," I gasped. How could it end like this? I'd made it this far. I weakly slapped the wall once more. And it opened. I felt the tingle of salt air touch my face. I gulped in a breath. My legs were still wedged, or so I thought. As I shifted, expecting a struggle between stone, my body rolled. I was free. Did the passageway expand? Ahead of me was further darkness. I was unsure of what I was entering, but that smell was like the ocean. Was I outside? Impossible, right? I descended hundreds, maybe thousands of feet below the ocean's surface. Which posed another question. Why hadn't I been affected by the depth yet? I slowly crawled from the tunnel, reaching blindly in front of me. I did not feel anything solid beyond the opening. I crawled a little further, still well aware that something had been in the tunnel with me, and I needed to get out. Further, my body was half out. My balance became unsteady with another reach, and then I plummeted. It was a long enough fall for me to have the fleeting thought of, "Oh shit," along with the sudden slap of nausea. It wasn't long enough for me to yell or cry. When a person is startled, they don't tend to belt out a scream like movies would have you believe. It's almost as if the opposite happens. Like terror shoots down your throat, frightens your vocal cords, and then jolts your unsuspecting heart. I hit the water like a boulder, sinking deep, fast. I was conscious, and as far as I could tell through the adrenaline, mostly uninjured, but it was dark. So dark that I wasn't quite sure I'd opened my eyes. Which way was up? I exhaled some bubbles. I couldn't see, but I could feel. I followed the sensation, kicking my legs and pulling with my arms. I swam towards the surface. It was a long swim and my lungs were aching. Or they were empty. I hadn't had the opportunity to suck in air before the fall. Please don't drown, I thought. Not when you've gotten this far. I reached the surface, coughed out salt water and hungrily inhaled air. I wasn't going to drown. For now, at least. That was the good news. But a faint light had appeared overhead. Not a torch or flame. A white light, like the moon. Reassuring at first glance, but as I peered across the water, I saw that the light glimmered off wet stone walls. I was still inside the tower. My hope was shattered. I felt stupid for expecting that traveling downwards
would lead me to the surface. That didn't make any damn sense. And not only was I still in the tower, I also no longer had the sword. I dropped it when I made contact with the water.
Fuck!
I shouted at the top of my lungs. The feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, and fear had all boiled over into a cocktail of rage. My exasperated roar reverberated through the chamber. I floated in the water, angrily panting. I was tired and frustrated. I wanted so desperately for it to be over. I wanted to see Hannah again. But then I saw something. No, I saw someone. Ahead, someone was floating on the other side of the chamber, watching me. A man, bearded like the others. "Hey!" I yelled out to him. He did not answer. I swam in place for a moment, considering my next move. Should I swim to the stranger or try to avoid him? So far, no one had attempted to harm me, not even the wolf, so why not go to him? But I didn't need to, because as soon as I had that thought, he moved towards me. His head remained above the water, eyes locked onto me. I noticed more movement from the periphery and glanced away from the man. There was a woman too. She was swimming towards me, like the man, same breaststroke and wide-eyed gaze. As they got closer, I realized that the water was rippling more than you'd expect from two people swimming. The water was moving from them like whales swimming across the surface. And that's when I saw how large their heads were. I began to plan my retreat, but to where? No doors or stairs that I could see. The man and woman came to a halt and floated several yards from me. Even from that distance, it was clear that these were not humans, or at least not like any I'd ever seen. Their heads alone were the size of my entire body. Their eyes were large and unblinking, not wide with fear, more like they were staring into my soul. I couldn't find any words. These couldn't be prisoners, right? The man spoke. His voice was a gentle thunder.
"Hell says to take you to the bottom."
What I'd heard was hell, thinking my greatest fear had been realized.
I don't...
Something grabbed a hold of my ankle and yanked me underwater. I was being pulled downwards. I struggled to escape, but I was being pulled too quickly and with too much force. All of a sudden, somebody snagged my other ankle. I was being pulled faster, deeper. They were too strong. I couldn't get away. There was zero visibility in the pitch black depths of the water. Like before, I had been caught off guard and unable to inhale before being submerged. My lungs were hurting once again, and we weren't slowing down. Maybe I was going to drown after all. Then we stopped. I noticed a nearing glow from above. I glanced towards it and could see that the moon-like orb from earlier had moved into the water and was now illuminating my surroundings. Everything was blurry, as was expected, while underwater, but I could finally see women surrounded me, all nude, all beautiful. They weren't mermaids, if you're wondering, although at this point I wouldn't have been surprised. These looked like human women. There was a peacefulness. I'd always found being underwater relaxing, an escape from the madness above the surface, calm and quiet. I began to wonder, was I dying? Were these angels? Reality sunk its fangs back into me. I was dying, but first, I had to drown, and that wasn't going to be easy. My body began to convulse. My vision began to fade. The temptation to inhale water was growing. Just get it over with, I thought. Breathe it in. As deep as I was, swimming to the surface in time was impossible. I was going to die, and these women were going to watch. I closed my eyes and silently apologized to Hannah and surrendered. But I didn't breathe in water. Instead, air was given to me. My eyes shot open. One of the women had her mouth pressed to mine and refilled my lungs. My vision was coming back. My body was still. My rapid beating heart began to calm.
She pulled away and smiled. I looked at the women floating around me and counted 7 of them. The giant swam above, observing, the orb of light between them. Suddenly, my legs were jerked beneath me and I was being pulled to the bottom again. Fear raced back into my mind, but the light was following us and I could still see 2 women were pulling me, making it 9 women in total, not counting the female giant. How were they able to swim so fast? We were rushing through the water. I noticed that the 7 other women were keeping pace alongside us, and above were the giants and the orb following. We were moving like a torpedo through the water. Again, I had the fleeting thought of, why wasn't I being affected by the depth? Going that deep should have been deadly. I could see that we were darting towards a grayish twisting structure that followed the entire circumference of the chamber and then overlapped and went between itself, almost like a giant knot. Then it moved. As we got closer, I could make out exactly what it was I was looking at. I swung my arms fast and wide, trying to get away, but the women were pulling me with too much force. They were dragging me towards a giant serpent. Bubbles raced from my mouth as I cried out in terror. The menacing yellow eyes of the beast hungrily watched us descend towards it. There was nowhere for us to go. The serpent took up the entire rest of the chamber. We were getting closer, and it became clear how enormous the serpent was. More extensive than any whale I'd ever seen. Bigger than the wolf from the last chamber. This had to be the largest creature to have ever existed. Closer, almost touching it at this point. I braced for what would come next. And then it shifted, creating a space in the center. We rushed between the coiled serpent, and I could finally see what looked like an opening in the center of the stone bottom. But it didn't make any sense. How was I going to get out of the water? I would have to go up for air, not down, right? I was being pulled towards a black void. My lungs were aching again. Whatever waited on the other side, I was going to need air again, soon. Finally, we reached the opening. The women let go of me, leaving me floating above it.
Come to me.
I heard from the blackness below, with the clarity one would not expect to hear underwater. Was he in there? The one who awaits upon the throne of blood and bone?
Come to me.
The voice said again. I glanced up. The women, the giants, the serpent, they were all watching me and waiting for my next move. I swam into the void. The void took me into its inky blackness and set me down into another stone room. I was standing. I was disoriented from having gone from swimming to standing in a blink of an eye. The room was small, at least compared to the vast spaces I'd been in prior. Above me, I could see the void, a black hole of nothingness. There wasn't any water in this room, aside from what dripped from my wet body. Candles sat spread in a circle along the edges of the floor. Their light glimmered off something near my feet. The sword. I assumed it had drifted off to the bottom after I dropped it and into the void. I knelt and picked it up. A feeling coursed through me that's tough to describe. It felt like a reunion with an old friend. The room was empty aside from the candles. No door, nothing. I began to wonder, why is traveling through this tower so complicated? Like an obstacle course. Why not have stairs throughout the entire tower? Thor had mentioned that demons, which at the time sounded like an exaggeration, collected the swords he forged and took them to the lower chamber. Is that who I heard slapping against the stone as I crawled through that shrinking tunnel? I cast the thoughts from my mind to focus on finding a way to the next room. I walked along the wall, searching for an opening, a loose stone, anything. I did the same as I crawled along the floor. I looked back to the void in the ceiling. It wasn't so high as to be unreachable. I stepped below it. Running out of options, I asked, "Now what?" The void answered. From its center,
blackness began to leak towards the floor, but it did not drip. It lowered. It was dangling above. That's when I realized the void was not dripping like running ink. This was something equally black but separate. It was hair. I backed away, sword held at the ready. The hair was growing. So long it nearly touched the floor. Then a hand followed. 2 hands. One pale, one flesh. The other rotten and corpse-like. Her head was next. She was facing away from me, but I still recognized her as the woman from the wolf's chamber. To me, she seemed almost as if being birthed. I was unnerved by what I was witnessing. There was nowhere for me to go, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I did not blink. It felt like a risk to do so, but it didn't matter because in a flash, the woman appeared on her feet facing me. It was as if I had a lapse in memory. I gasped. She glared at me behind a curtain of hair.
Are you ready to continue?
She asked. I swallowed and said, yes. She lifted her head as if her intended move had been interrupted.
You have questions.
I don't know what gave it away, but I had questions. So many questions. I didn't even know where to start. My mind spun in circles. I exhaled. Where am I?
It is many things. A prison, a home, a gateway.
A gateway?
You will see.
Who are you?
Hell.
A chill spread through me. Hell is what I heard. Same as when the giant said it. This was hell, I thought. And this woman, the devil? Your name is Hell? She nodded. Does the gateway lead to hell?
It leads to many places.
I thought for a moment. I'd never heard Satan referred to as the place he ruled over, hell. But I did not realize at the time that she was not Satan, and this was not hell. Similar, I'd come to learn, but different. Who was the one who awaits below?
He is the fate of the gods.
I don't understand.
You will.
You are aligned with him?
My father is. I am aligned with my father.
I was confused. Her father? That must be Satan, I thought. But if Satan was not the one who awaits below, then who was? There was a sudden coolness to the air and a whisper that clawed at my bones.
Come to me,
it said. Hell heard it as well and said,
He is waiting.
My blood ached. Why did his summoning pain me now? I nodded and the floor began to vibrate. I stumbled and caught myself. Hell stood unflinching. I watched the rounded wall rise. The void was growing further and further out of reach. I realized it was not a rising wall, but instead that the floor was descending like an elevator. Trying to speak over the loud scraping stone against stone, I hollered, "What is next?" Without having to raise her voice over the grinding rock, Hell said,
My father.
"What is he going to do?"
He will travel with us to the bottom.
I watched the half-corpse woman for a moment. Okay. I waited for several minutes as we continued to descend. Again, the thought struck me how strange the tower's design was. Small rooms followed by large chambers. Long, wide stairways followed by an even more extended ladder. A pool of blood, a collection of water, a crawlspace where stairs or a ladder would have sufficed. And then there was the platform, hundreds of feet in size, descending deep into the tower. So much unused space. The center of the platform began to rise, and the movement ceased. The chamber fell silent. I looked upwards towards the void, now a distant speck. Hell stepped to the center and into the hollowed-out stone block that now jutted from the floor. I followed. Inside was another spiral stairwell. Again, I was perplexed by the design of this tower. I've experienced more consistency in dreams than in this place. Hell radiated a moonlight glow that I could use as a guide down the stairs. It was a light like that I had seen in the water-filled chamber. We traveled around and around until we finally reached an opening. The room was scorching hot and brighter than any of the previous chambers. Hell walked through without hesitation. As I followed, I realized that the wall itself was on fire. A wall of flames. I stepped forward, shielding my eyes and taking shallow breaths. I stepped on something stick-like. It recoiled and hissed. A snake. I fell back into the stairwell, realizing the entire floor was covered in snakes. Hell stood amongst them, waiting. I do not trust snakes, not even the non-venomous ones. To say I was frightened is an understatement. There was no giant serpent like I'd seen in the water-filled chamber above. But this chamber lacked the fear of drowning, the desperation for air. I can look past certain fears when I'm fighting to survive. Here, there wasn't anything to distract me other than snakes. They began to slither away, all moving towards each other. They met at a spot next to Hell and began to pile onto one another. Stacking, twisting, forming into something. Legs, waist, torso. Snakes slithered further up the shape. Arms. They curled into a ball atop the shoulders, a head. The snake formation was complete. It moved towards me. With each step, several snakes would fall, only to slither up the others and back into place. I held up my sword and slid further back onto the steps. The figure kept approaching and the snakes began to morph into regular human legs, then upwards to the chest. And as the figure was standing in front of me, it had changed into a flesh and bone human. Tall and lean and clothed in emerald linen. His red hair dangled past his ears and stopped at an angular jaw. A pointed chin highlighted by a pointier goatee sat below a mischievous grin. His nose was sharp and his eyes were narrow. His brow arched intensely, contrary to his smile. His following words sparked more confusion.
"Oh, how disappointed I am that you've returned."
His speech was playful but in a sarcastic sort of way, with a hint of resentfulness. "Who?" I began to stutter. "Who are you?"
"You don't remember?"
The man turned to Hell and laughed.
Oh, I'm going to enjoy this."
He faced me again and knelt, placing his elbows atop his knees. He stared hard into my eyes.
"I'm going to enjoy this very much."
The fire raged along the walls as the man dragged me across the stone floor. I did not fight him. What would be the point? His strength was inhuman. He let go of me in the center of the chamber. The sweltering heat was too much to bear. I swallowed shallow, painful breaths and closed my stinging eyes. There was a sound of shifting stone. I stole a glance before once again shutting my eyes off from the intense heat. The opening was narrow, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet.
"Climb through,"
the man ordered. I did as he said, anxious to get somewhere cooler. I blinked as I crawled on my hands and knees and reached inside the opening. A smooth surface descended at an angle. I slipped inside, arms first, and then began to slide down the dark chamber. That's what it was, a slide. It wasn't fun in the way that slides usually are. I knew it likely wouldn't lead to anywhere pleasant. Around and around I slid, and when it finally did end, I landed in a lit chamber with a sand-covered floor. I was relieved it wasn't more blood. I looked to the slide for the others. The image of the half-corpse woman riding down a slide seemed almost comical, but she never did come down. Instead, there was a shuffling of sand, and from it, she emerged. And from the slide poured dozens of snakes. I jolted backwards towards Hell, somehow the more comforting figure amongst all else. The snakes slithered and twisted, and they became the red-headed man in green. "Who is he?" I whispered to Hell. Her response was delayed, not out of confusion or fear. More so, she chose to answer at her own pace. She said,
My father.
The man did not look to be older than the woman, perhaps even the opposite. But the two of them, having exhibited some magic, made me inclined to believe she was telling the truth. What is his name? The man lunged forward and stopped Hell.
Not yet. Let's not spoil the surprise.
Why all the elusiveness? Just tell me, I argued. The man smiled.
Oh, but you are ignorant in this form. The reveal will be so underwhelming if you do not remember.
Then how am I to remember?
Eden's apples,
He laughed.
The fruit of the gods?
Idun, the woman, the one-eyed man had told held the key to ending this. I wondered if Hel and her father were trying to help me, although they did not feel like friends. Where is this Idun? I asked.
The one who awaits keeps her near to him.
The bottom, I realized. How much further would that be? I looked around the room. It was another empty chamber minus the sand. How do we get to the next room? I asked. The man motioned at the sand.
Dig.
I set down my sword and ran my hand through the fine grains of sand. Why is the tower designed this way? Getting to each chamber is so unnecessarily complicated. The man smiled.
I am the one who designed it.
I looked up at him. Why did you do it this way?
Because I am me.
And who am I?
You are you. Now dig.
I turned back to the sand and began shoveling handfuls. It was not easy, as much of the sand would fall back in, refilling the hole. I quickened my pace, one scoop after another until I reached something solid. I found the door, I exclaimed. Hurry and open it before the sand covers it again. The man chuckled and reached to the door.
Not sand. It is bone.
I looked around me, realizing the whiteness of it had been difficult to notice beneath the orangish glow of the torches. The man lifted the door, bone pouring through the opening. He motioned for me to enter. I dropped into a darker chamber. Powdered bone fell onto me in the floor. The room was small. I could reach the ceiling above. The man dropped in beside me. Hell, once again, seemed to just appear. The overhead door sealed shut, and the room went completely black. It reeked of urine and feces. I can't see, I said. The man's fingertips lit like candles. He used them to light some nearby torches. Chained along the walls, their arms and legs spread like an X, were 3 men. They looked much like the previous prisoners I'd seen. Long hair and bearded. They watched us through weary eyes.
Hello, boys.
Hell's father greeted. The men let out a tired groan.
Loki.
One of the men gasped. The red-headed man shushed him, but it was too late. You're Loki? I asked. He rolled his eyes.
Thanks for spoiling the surprise, Tyr.
Like the Norse god? I asked.
Yes, I am him, and this is Tyr.
Loki pulled a dagger and stabbed Tyr in the gut. Tyr cried from the pain. Loki lifted the blade rigidly, disemboweling Tyr, and then wiped it off the chest of the next man. Tyr had been eviscerated. His body trembled as he hung dying. My stomach dropped as I watched. I glanced to Hel to see if she had any reaction to the brutality we had just seen. She had not flinched.
This one here is Hermod.
Loki grabbed a fistful of the man's hair and held the dagger to his throat.
He's the reason you're alive again. Isn't that right, Hermod?
Hermod looked at me and his eyes widened. He opened his mouth to speak before he was violently interrupted. He let out a wet gurgle as Loki slit his throat. A fountain of blood poured from his neck as the life drained out of him. The final man listened with dread at the sound of the dying men. His empty gaze was that of a blind man.
And then we have Hod,
Loki said as he approached him.
Oh, how useful this blind fool was.
Loki ran the backs of his fingers across the frightened man's cheek.
He's the one who killed you.
Loki reared back and drove the dagger through the center of the man's head, killing him instantly. There was a splintering sound as Loki removed the blade from Hod's skull. He turned to me and smirked.
But now you're back.
Loki stepped over to me and watched as the remaining 2 men bled to death. I could not. I had to look away. The trembling and gagging stopped, leaving behind only the steady dripping of blood as it rolled down their legs and off their feet. My hands shook as I gripped my useless sword. The floor opened and Loki guided me over, a spiraling stairwell. I glanced once more at the poor souls. I thought to myself, at least they would no longer suffer.
Make yourself useful, daughter,
said Loki as he led me down the stairs. I stole a glance of hell approaching the hanging men before my vision was obstructed. As we descended further, I could hear gasping overhead as they were resurrected back to life. Loki spoke before I could.
Your brothers live again.
My brothers? Loki sighed as he continued down the stairs.
Unfortunately.
Enough beating around the bush. Tell me who I am. Loki did not stop.
As much as I wanted to keep it a surprise, I suspect your mother will not be so cooperative.
My breathing halted. My mother?
Yes, she's in the next room. Come on.
We traveled further down the stairs, my heart racing with anticipation. We entered a large stone chamber, another mostly empty one. An older woman was chained to the floor in the center of the room, slumped over and staring at the ground. We moved towards her, my heart ready to explode inside my chest. This was not my mother, not the one I grew up knowing, but there was something deep within me that recognized her. She weakly lifted her head and let out a whimper that echoed through the chamber like a cathedral. Tears began to fill her eyes.
My son.
Her frail voice trembled. Loki did not make any attempt to interrupt, despite appearing annoyed. I slowly approached the older woman, close enough I could see her clearly. Her long white hair, her gaunt wrinkled face. Her eyes searched me in astonishment. She uttered my name, the name I had been unable to remember.
Baldur.
I knew very little about Norse mythology. I grew up in Oklahoma, far from Europe, from Iceland. To be honest, I couldn't have even told you exactly where Norse mythology originated. I moved to Florida because of my love for the ocean, something I didn't get any exposure to in the plains of Oklahoma. I liked the idea of the ocean. My childhood room was decorated with surfing posters and model sailboats. Despite not having experience in either surfing or sailing, but I grew up. I started a successful business, and before I knew it, I could afford to live out my dreams. I met Hannah while taking surf lessons. We were both novices at the time. I still am, but she stuck with it. We hit it off immediately. Similar goals, similar upbringing. We dated for only 5 months before we got married. There are moments in life where you can feel you're no longer swimming against the tide, and, instead, swimming with it. Effortlessness. Following the natural flow. The love Hannah and I shared is not forced. It never will be. We knew this right away. There was something in me that recognized Hannah when I first met her, deep in my subconscious. How much lies within us so deeply, but is never revealed, is never strong enough to rise to the surface. Love is different. True love, I mean. It's powerful. It will rise from the depths of your soul, grip your heart and sing, "We're home." The woman chained to the stone floor claimed she was my mother, and although her face was unfamiliar, I knew her.
Baldur, my son,
she said, a weak smile curling the corners of her mouth. I am so sorry. I do not know your name. I apologized.
I am Frigg, your mother.
I don't remember. Her eyes swelled with tears. Her lips trembled.
What name do you go by now?
Nate.
Your eyes are still the same, Nate.
I stared at the feeble older woman. Time is not what aged her, made her skin sag, her hair lose color, her voice weakened. She was drained, an emptied vessel, once vibrant and strong. Yours is too, I said. She allowed herself another tired smile. She looked past Loki, whose presence she seemed keen to ignore, and said to Hel,
Thank you for allowing him to return.
Hel did not respond. I don't understand what is going on, I said to Frigg. She returned her gaze to me.
No, you won't. Not fully. Not without Indune's apples.
Loki says she's with the one who awaits. Frigg's eyes narrowed at the mention of Loki. She briefly stole an angry glance at him, her first acknowledgement of his presence.
Do not trust Loki.
Behind me, Loki snickered.
Oh, Frigg.
He is wicked.
Frigg spoke forcefully while glaring at him.
He tricked your brother into killing you. You, Balder, the most beloved of the gods.
And look, he's back.
Loki argued playfully. Frigg remained silent, fuming from a deep-seated rage she could not release. She waited for it to settle, like stirred sediment sinking back to the bottom. She turned her focus to me.
You being here did not occur by chance.
My wife Hannah and I found the tower while sailing. We didn't seek it out.
Hannah.
Frigg sounded pleased.
Oh, you found each other then.
I'm trying to get back to her.
Yes. You two were inseparable. She died of a broken heart the first time.
Wait, I knew her before? Are you sure? Frigg smiled.
I suspect that it's no coincidence that, as Balder, you were married to Nanna, and as Nate, you are married to Hannah.
I couldn't resist a slight grin. Nana. I really had known her before, hadn't I? But what about my name, Nate? It was not similar to Balder in any way. In fact, my real name was Nathaniel. But I always thought it was too fancy, too outdated. I preferred Nate. Even my parents, who of course chose my name, had always called me Nate.
Tell me, have you seen your father?
Asked Frigg. My Norse knowledge was limited, but I knew that Odin was the father of Thor and Balder. And I remembered that Thor had said the one-eyed man was his father. I have seen Odin, yes.
How is he?
Better than you, if I'm being honest. Frigg coughed out a laugh.
Good.
I let myself smile with her. When they faded and a sense of hopelessness began to creep back in, I asked, what about my parents? Nate's parents. Frigg raised her eyebrows, waiting for me to continue. Were they Norse gods too? Frigg looked past me to Hel for the answer. I followed her gaze, as did Loki. Hel remained silent for a moment and then said,
Hermod pleaded for your release, to bring you back to life as you were. I told him that all must feel great sadness and weep for you if I were to let you return. Hermod did not think it was possible to continue grieving if everyone knew that by doing so, you would live once again. So an agreement was made. You would not return as Balder, but instead be born into the world as a human, as would Nanna, and the gods would mourn from then on, with the knowledge that you were no longer a god and that you would never remember yourself as such.
It was as if I were both living and dead, a condemnation that I realized was perhaps a reflection of the half-decaying goddess herself. But what does that have to do with my parents? Hell made a noise that sounded something like a sigh.
They were not gods, but that is not to say they were not influenced by such.
I don't understand. And by his expression, neither did Loki.
Hugin and Munin, they fly across the earth as eyes and ears for Odin, and sometimes they are also messengers.
Loki let out a frustrated laugh.
Of course, those stupid ravens.
Ravens. When I was a child, 2 ravens showed up outside the house fairly often. They were curious birds. Despite them often being uninterested in the food I'd set out, they'd hang around regardless, just watching.
They are thought and memory,
continued Hel.
and it appears that Odin is still able to influence the world outside this tower, as he has done with you. His ravens planted seeds within your being, and that of your parents. For you, a passion which would steer you to this tower, where you can, once again, become a god, and perhaps free the others. For your parents, guidance, to give you opportunities to learn and to grow, to shape you into a man worthy of being a god.
Hel paused and looked at me for a moment.
And they gave you something else as well, a name.
Nathaniel?
That is the name you've been given to fit the human tradition. One called Nate is never just Nate. But to all who know you, that is your name. Perhaps Odin found humor in naming you after how you returned.
I thought quietly for a moment, unsure quite what Hel meant. It was Frigg who finally uttered the answer.
Reincarnate.
Hel nodded. I was speechless. It was as if my entire life had been designed for this moment. Odin, the one-eyed man in the rowboat, he knew so much more than he had let on. Imprisoned in the tower, and without even knowing he existed, he managed to guide me to this very point. He shaped who I am, and as a result, I could become who I once was. But I had first to find a doen. I looked to Loki. Take me to the bottom. His eyebrows flicked upward, and he gave his mischievous grin.
As you wish.
Suddenly, 2 stones on either side of the chamber shifted slightly, and water from the ocean outside began to spill into the room. What's going on? I panicked. Frigg swiveled nervously to see the 2 fountains of water filling the chamber.
You must make a decision,
Loki said.
Either go to the bottom and become a god once again, or save your dear mother from drowning, a death she will not return from.
I looked at Frigg. I could not remember her as my mother, but I knew it in my heart to be true. I had a deep love for her that exceeded both time and space. Not even for Odin did I feel such a bond. She looked at me, hesitated a moment, and then her jaw settled, and her expression became that of acceptance.
Believe me.
Frigg, I began.
It is important that you get to the bottom.
I can't let you drown. I had only just met this woman, but my heart could not bear to leave her. The water was rising steadily. It was now to her waist and almost to my knees.
Become like a god again, Nate,
she said and waved me towards her. She pulled me close and whispered into my ear the only thing that could kill Balder.
If you can avoid it, you cannot be defeated,
she said. I leaned back and looked into her eyes. I nodded. She smiled, the water now just under her chest. I'm sorry, I apologized.
You are my son,
she said, and I knew that meant more. The water was to her neck. She steadied herself and in the blink of an eye was submerged. The water lifted Loki and me above her, rising towards the ceiling. Hel stood beneath the water as if it were dry land. She watched as Frigg surrendered herself to death. I looked to Loki. My hatred for him had grown in the brief time I'd known him to something primal. I wanted to tear his limbs apart, to make him suffer, but I needed him to get to the bottom. It was a bitter pill. "How do we get to the next chamber?" I asked, the water still rising.
When the water reaches the ceiling, he will let us in.
I looked upward, not much further. "Where's the entrance?" Loki did not respond. He giggled as the water filled the last bit of space. I took a deep breath and went under. The stone shifted shut. The chamber was full, not a single opening for air. To my right, Loki floated comfortably. Below me, Frigg was chained and lifeless. Hel was like a stone at the bottom, her long hair swaying in the water like thick, black smoke. Then I heard the beckoning whisper of the one who awaits.
Come to me.
It pulsated through my blood and sent a sharp jolt into my head. He was near. The floor fell open, and we plummeted within the falling water to a dark abyss. Weightlessness accompanied the sinking sensation inside my stomach, further into darkness. And then impact, submerged into something wet. I recognized it immediately, thicker than water. Blood. I quickly swam to the surface and sucked in a breath. I could taste metal, smell the copper odor. The chamber was dark. The rising water had extinguished the flames in the room above, which was now an extension of the section we were currently in. I had a flash of panic. My sword, I gripped with my right hand and then quickly relaxed. I hadn't let it go. After everything, I had forgotten I was holding it. I did not know where to swim. I could not see anything. Then, as if on cue, hundreds of torches along the walls lit up. I could now see that this chamber was significantly more expansive than any previous ones. And on the far side of the room, there he was, waiting, up on his throne of blood and bone. I had reached the bottom. The blood around me began to ripple. Rising through the wet surface were dozens of heads, a slick crimson sheen over featureless faces, void of eyes, nose, and a mouth. They were human-shaped and nothing more. They swam slowly towards him, escorting me along the way. A pyramid of skulls protruded from the sea of blood. From the various orifices of each skull poured forth even more blood. The pyramid was capped off with the throne, which was itself made of bone. A large figure sat atop, his eyes like burning suns floating side by side in a vast space. An impenetrable blackness beneath the gray hood. His tattered robe was like tangled webs that swayed with an absent wind. I craned my neck as I came closer to the pyramid, a massive structure of thousands of skulls. He watched me without speaking. I felt his aura of evil. It permeated this chamber more intensely than any of those prior. Loki and Hel were already at the pyramid. They stood beneath an archway of an opening that led into the interior of the bone structure. I climbed from the blood and joined them. I turned back to look at the mannequin-like beings who had accompanied me. They remained waiting in the blood, observing me it would seem, but lacking any features to observe with. "What now?" I asked. Loki motioned towards the interior. There was a faint glow within. I gripped the handle of my sword, steadied my breath, and entered the pyramid. Candles flickered along the floor, a floor made of stone rather than bone. In the middle of the room was an altar. A man lay supine atop it, his arms and legs restrained. I glanced upwards. He, the one who awaited, sat above us, unseen. I returned my gaze to the man on the altar. He was alive, although aged and frail. "Who is he?" I asked. Nobody responded. I turned around and found that Loki and Hel were not with me.
He wants you to remember.
A female voice said softly, startling me from behind. A woman had emerged from a dark corner, silky auburn hair and youthful skin. She was healthy in a way I had not seen since entering the tower.
She was inviting in a way I had not experienced. In her outstretched hand, an apple.
You're a doen?
I muttered. She gave a slight smile, a tired smile like that of Frigg, but beautiful. An out-of-place beauty, like a lone flower in an ashen forest. The apple in her hand glowed golden, although not in a metallic sense. It was plump, healthy, edible gold. Odin, Thor, Frigg, they told me to eat the apple, that doing so would be my only hope of escaping. I reached out and took it from her hand. I could feel the energy pulsating inside it. I looked at Adun and asked, "Why does he want me to remember?" There was pity in her eyes when she looked at me. She answered,
He wants you to remember, so that the truth can be revealed.
I looked at the apple in my hand. The truth will set you free. I just hoped, in my case, that was literal. I sunk my teeth into the crisp golden fruit. The effects were instant, like waking from a dream. I'd been so limited before and so restrained from my true self. People often complain about how difficult it is to run in a dream, like slogging through mud. As Nate, the path was muddy, but not anymore, not as Boulder. I could feel I had changed physically. My muscles were larger, firmer. I no longer looked like Nate. My body was strong. Fatigue dissipated entirely. I felt my facial structure and hair had changed and was Boulder's once again. But one thing remained. I looked at Adun and she back to me. We recognized each other, and just like my mother Frigg had noticed, she too said,
Your eyes are the same.
I smiled. Hello, Adun. I turned around to see who was lying atop the altar. He was older than I remembered, but I recognized his face. Frey. He looked weakly in my direction. His eyes began to water.
You're alive.
His voice trembled. I placed my hand on his. Yes.
You have to stop him.
I glanced to the ceiling. The robed figure I'd seen earlier was not familiar. Who is he? I asked. Frey opened his mouth to answer and was interrupted by a deafening shriek. I fell to my knees. The sound pierced into my soul. I pressed my hands to my ears. It felt as if the high-pitched sound was drilling into my brain. Suddenly, it stopped, and the pyramid abruptly expanded outward. The skulls separated and hovered midair, as if gravity had left them. They grew further apart, and then it became apparent that at some point, the location of the pyramid had changed. What we were in was no longer a large yet confined chamber. This was a massive, fiery expanse. A river of blood ran through the landscape of bone, upon which walked hundreds of featureless human forms. They hammered iron and dragged chains. They hand-cranked ancient machines. They smelted rock and sharpened bone. They were working. For what reason, I could not see. I glanced upward for the throne. It had vanished. Frey remained restrained to the altar, and Adun stood near. Behind them, Loki and Hel. I was overcome with rage and swept by the realization that I was again capable of hurting a god. I gripped my sword and charged Loki. He uttered, holding in front of him a sharpened shaft of mistletoe. Having been a human, I can attest to the idea of mistletoe causing a pause to a god as seeming silly. After all, it is just mistletoe. But it is for that reason, mistletoe being so harmless to all, it is the most harmful to me. The truth is that within all things there is life, cosmic energy that has filled all vessels big and small. It is in me, it is in you, it is in the mistletoe, and it takes a shape which we might call a soul. It becomes a unique form of the whole. Gods and humans are not far different. We are simply different kinds of vessels, and gods themselves vary from other gods. My mother, Frigg, could communicate with the souls within all things. When I was born, she had all agreed to never harm me. The soul of fire, the soul of water, the soul of metal, the soul of stone, each and everything. However, one thing did not agree: mistletoe. Why did mistletoe not agree? Fate, perhaps? It is not as if mistletoe is particularly disagreeable. Frigg shrugged it off, however, saying to herself, well, it's just mistletoe. But she kept it secret regardless. Until one day, Loki manipulated her into revealing the truth. My invulnerability was entertainment to many. They'd shoot arrows at me to watch them bounce off. Loki took advantage of this. He replaced an arrow with a pointed shaft of mistletoe and tricked my blind brother Hod into shooting it at me. Perhaps you already know the story of how I died. And here I was again, faced with Loki holding the one thing that could kill me. But this time, I was ready. He only succeeded before because I had not expected it.
What do you want, Loki?
I asked.
Me?
He chuckled.
It was he who summoned you.
He pointed past me. I watched Loki, hesitant to turn around while still holding the mistletoe. Loki rolled his eyes and tossed the mistletoe over his shoulder into the river of blood.
Happy?
He asked. I looked at him for a moment longer and then turned around. He stood a great distance away, off in the fiery horizon. But the one who I'd seen sitting upon the throne was different now. His height stretched miles above, a giant of mountainous proportions. His sun-like eyes appeared as if to scale, almost too bright to even look at. He moved a step closer, his tattered robes so long that I could not tell if he were walking or floating. In a single stride, he covered a length that would have taken a man an hour to traverse. I watched in awe, still unsure of who this being was. He stopped several miles from me and knelt. His web-like robe, now so large that it was resemblant of something more like a massive storm cloud. He towered over me, glaring with his burning eyes, and I noticed that within his hood was not a vast space, as it seemed from afar. He had a face. It was made unclear by shadows. Nonetheless, he had one.
Balder!
He said. It was both a whisper and a roar. A thunderous vocalization that simultaneously shook the ground and clawed at my skin. I could feel his breath, like a humid gust. Tell me who you are, I said. He laid out an enormous pale hand, palm up, quaking the ground as he did so. Pointed fingernails large enough to be the hulls of ships extended from his finger. A shiver ran down my spine, and I reluctantly scaled his hand and into his palm. The giant stood. Miles above the ground, he lifted me. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the shadows beneath his hood, he appeared. A copy of the giant who held me, but the size of that which I saw seated upon his throne atop the pyramid of skulls. A giant still, nearly 20 feet tall by my estimate, but not nearly the size of the behemoth which held us. He drifted down the arm, his arm, and joined me in his palm. He towered over me, watching me as I shuddered.
I was born from blood.
He began.
That which your father and his brothers spilled. The blood drowned many and became the ocean. Do you know whose blood I speak of?
I nodded. Ymir.
Yes, from Ymir's flesh, the earth was shaped. From his bones, mountains, stones from his teeth, seas from his blood. But what you did not know is that some of that blood leaked through into the core of the earth, and it changed.
What is your name?
You know my name.
Then say it. He reached to his hood and lowered it. I recoiled at the grotesqueness of what I initially thought was melting flesh, but soon realized that I was looking at a face akin to those I had seen below, the featureless human-shaped forms. But he was not featureless, not anymore. His mouth was torn flesh, an opening that had not been there in an earlier time. His eyes were glowing red orbs that had seemingly burst through the skin. His nose jagged slits. His ears were massive punctures in the side of his head. He observed my reaction for a moment, then stepped closer. I stumbled a step back.
Are you frightened, Balder?
He asked. He showed his pale, empty hands.
I do not carry mistletoe.
I did not respond.
All of the gods know my name, but they did not know me as I am.
He said. Who are you? I gripped my sword tighter as he moved another step closer.
I was not meant to exist, but there was a soul within all things, Balder. You know this. And there was within the blood of Ymir one very powerful, one that willed itself to be more. It grew into something faceless, a shape, a prison of flesh which it tore through. And here I am. I see, and I speak, and I hear the satisfying screams of those who suffer within the tower. Those who once celebrated the spilling of Ymir's blood.
The horrible figure moved even closer, driving me towards the edge of the hand. I glanced down at the distant ground below.
Celebrate me, Balder!
He roared.
The doom of the gods is upon you, and it is more than an event. I am that doom. I am that which the prophets spoke of. I am Ragnarok!
Before I died, I had nightmares, visions of my death. My father, Odin, found this problematic and traveled to the underworld, Helheim, to get answers. Upon arriving, he discovered that they were expecting someone important, someone like a king. When he prodded for answers, he learned that it was me they were waiting for. Once he returned home, my father shared his findings with my mother, who subsequently convinced all things to promise to never harm me. Except mistletoe. My knowledge of Ragnarok came from what I had overheard from hushed conversations. After all, it was prophesied that my death would be what set it into motion. The others wanted to shield me from this. On the one hand, I wanted the prophets to be wrong. I didn't want to die. But on the other hand, if the prophets were incorrect, what use were they? But Ragnarok was real, not as an event, but as a living being. Something grotesque and evil. The blood of Ymir risen again, circulating within its realized flesh. Why me? I asked, balancing atop the tip of the enormous open hand. Why did my death awaken you?
I've been growing since the beginning of time. I flowed within the veins of Ymir and poured forth into a world built of that which I came from. I am all things. Do you not see? I am part of that which pledged an oath not to harm you. And then you died, Balder. The one god that might stand in my way was no longer.
I understood then that my death was not a trigger to awaken Ragnarok, but rather the removal of an obstacle. And now I'm back, I said. Release them from the tower. Ragnarok laughed a harsh and disgusting cackle.
You, Balder, are a prisoner like the others. A prison you entered willingly.
My fist tightened around the handle of the sword, perfectly balanced in my hand.
Look around you.
He continued.
This is the center of the earth. The sweltering core. rivers of blood, walls of flame, and seas of magma.
He pointed past me. I reluctantly turned and saw something that made my heart falter and my blood chill. In the distance was the tower, slowly descending into the magma. I'd seen enough. I lifted my sword and cut a streak of glinting silver through the air. It halted abruptly with a metallic clang, blade against blade. Ragnarok was wielding a sword that had been hidden beneath his robe.
I may not be able to kill you,
he hissed,
but I can make you suffer.
Ragnarok glided backward and up the giant's arm, as if swept by a heavy gust, and disappeared into the blackness beneath the gargantuan hood. A nervous blink of a moment passed, and from the same void spilled forth hundreds of faceless demons, scrambling towards me like a cluster of frenzied spiders. They could not harm me, but they could overwhelm me. I felt my skin crawl, perhaps a reflection of that in front of me, and promptly raised the sword above my head and sliced downward into the giant's middle finger, upon which I stood, severing the massive digit. I rapidly plummeted alongside the amputated finger beneath a crimson shower and slammed upright into the shore of broken bone, the crashing finger shaking the ground behind. Loki and Hel shielded their eyes from the leftover plume of bone dust as I briskly stomped towards them. I seized Loki by the throat with my empty hand and dangled him above the ground.
You built the tower, did you?
I directed his gaze to the sinking tower.
Then you tell me how to get them out.
I built it,
Loki wheezed,
but I do not control it.
My fingers dug deeper into his neck. I glared vengefully into his soul. Muscles swelled as Loki's face turned darker shades of blue. Hel placed a hand on my shoulder.
Please,
she said.
Leave him.
I looked into her pleading eyes. The goddess of death. Her glumness had shifted into something nervous and childlike. I relented and released Loki. I turned to Idun, who had become frightened at the sight of my rage.
Give Frey an apple so he can break from his restraints.
I glanced over my shoulder at the nearing horde of demons. Quickly.
Stop!
Loki yelled to Idun, causing her to hesitate.
Ragnarok spares me because I brought him the god of peace.
Loki giggled nervously and shrugged.
Peace for peace.
Fuck that. I held out my hand, and Idun tossed me an apple. Loki pleaded as I hurried to Frey and put the apple to his mouth. The swarm of faceless were stampeding towards us, nearly on us. Frey took a bite and quickly erupted from his shackles, rejuvenated to his original form, and took the sword from my waiting hand. He was a true swordsman, and although it was not his preferred blade, he wielded it efficiently. In a single fluid motion, he wheeled around and separated a legion of faceless heads from their pale, thrashing bodies. Dodging and weaving, hacking and stabbing, Frey unleashed a flurry of flashing silver and blood. It was an insurmountable stream of demons that continually cascaded from the shadowed mouth of the behemoth, tearing down his body like frenzied insects from a devastated nest. The towering Ragnarok kept his arms angled and his palms upwards as if absorbed in spiritual communion. Absent a weapon, I made do with my bare strength, heaving charging foes over and away, driving my fist through shattered bones, stomping those that crumpled at my feet. Idun quivered at our backs, shielding her basket of golden apples. A flicker of red and green passed my peripheral. Loki, slipping away from the carnage, his morose daughter sticking to his shadow.
We need to get to the tower,
I shouted to Frey. He speared the blade into the head of one demon, reached around and drove a different head into the hilt, and fiercely spread them apart, catching the sword as it fell from the splintered skulls.
Lead the way,
he breathed as he continued his onslaught. I grasped Idun's hand and sprinted towards the shoreline, Frey keeping pace behind us, the horde at his heels. The distant tower slowly being devoured by the magma. Was it a game to Ragnarok to not destroy it quickly, or was he simply not capable? I did not know. I did not care. All I knew that enough of the tower remained for me to save those I loved. We slid to a stop at the shoreline, the blistering heat clawing at Frey and Adun. I could feel its intensity, but I knew I was safe from any harm it may cause. Once again, the swarm was upon us. "Protect Adun," I said to Frey, and dove headfirst into the magma. I emerged sooted but intact, a blackened layer on my skin as if I merely swam through smoke and nothing more. I pulled and kicked, treading magma like water. The tower grew nearer. There was a sudden burst. A rising bubble ruptured that torpedoed me through the magma and back to the shoreline. I skidded to the feet of the frightened Adun, who gazed down at me, and then back to the magma. She gasped.
"It is Surtur."
Frey spun around mid-battle as I sat up. Surtur tore through the magma, a hair-raising and fearsome display. His skin charred, with scalding red veins coursing throughout his muscles. Fire circulated within him, smoldering eyes beneath the heavy, furrowed brow. We all stumbled backward, and were quickly brought back to attention by the rabid, faceless demons desperate to tear us to shreds. Frey resumed fighting.
"This is my fate, Baldur,"
he said between swings of the blade.
"I will fight Surtur."
I glanced at the approaching Jotun. "But he cannot kill me."
"He can distract you."
I looked to Adun. She smiled and nodded.
"I will stay with Frey."
"You can't. The apples. We need you." Adun placed a hand on my cheek and gently turned my gaze to the sinking tower. Its highest point was visible and descending towards the magma more rapidly than before. The majority of the tower had become submerged.
"The gods will not survive today,"
Adun said. I watched, aghast, broken-hearted. It was hopeless. With the tower no longer stretching outside the core, there was no way out. Not for weakened gods, frail and tired, robbed of their power. The shore quaked with Surtur's thunderous arrival. A flaming sword clenched at his waist. Frey glanced over at me.
"Do what needs to be done, Baldur. Then find us in Valhalla."
He turned his attention from the army of demons and charged Surtur. Idun smiled at me and took a step back and was swallowed into the stampeding horde. I shoved through the sea of demons and out the other side, their focus solely on Frey and Idun. I watched in anguish as they hung like leeches on the back of Frey, his blade crashing against Surtur's, sparks dancing about with each blow. Frey swung once more before the demons took his arms, and Surtur took his head. The demons promptly turned on Surtur. To this day, I do not know why. Perhaps Ragnarok found no use of him any longer. Maybe the demons didn't know any better. Surtur did not stick around. He slunk back into the magma and disappeared, and the demons followed to their fiery demise. Beyond them was the tower. Just a sliver of a rock peeking above the surface. How would have things turned out had Hannah and I continued past the sliver of rock on that foggy morning? I turned around and headed back to Ragnarok to do what had to be done.
Ragnarok!
I roared at the towering behemoth. His eyes opened and looked down at me, and faintly, within the dark beneath his hood, appeared to smirk. Once again from the darkness came his smaller, sword-wielding self. He dropped the great distance onto the ground in front of me and lowered his hood, revealing again his grotesque, torn face.
"I suppose you intend to kill me now,"
he said. "Do you plan to run?" He motioned with his hand at the surroundings.
"There is nowhere for me to run."
I had no sword, no weapon, but missing from Ragnarok's left hand was his middle finger. He could be hurt. I charged him. He dodged out of the way and I stumbled past. I clenched my fist and turned and rushed him again. He darted out of the way again and swept my feet out from beneath me with his sword. My back slammed against the bone-covered surface.
"I cannot kill you, Baldur."
Ragnarok said, leaning over me. He poked my throat with the tip of his blade.
Not with this.
I slapped the blade out of the way and jumped to my feet and became startled by what awaited me. Standing off to Ragnarok's side was Loki, holding a spear fashioned from mistletoe.
But I can kill you with mistletoe,
leered Ragnarok. My stomach nodded. Loki, you bastard, I said through gritted teeth. Loki grinned and shrugged. Hel stood behind him, expressionless. Ragnarok held out his hand for Loki to give him the mistletoe.
You will not be leaving Helheim this time, Baldur. Not as a god, or as a human.
That's it, I thought. All of this just to die again. I failed to save the gods. I failed to return to Hannah. I failed. There was no doubt in my mind that Ragnarok would best me in combat, and ultimately, kill me. Yet there he stood, empty-handed.
Loki,
he hissed.
Hand over the mistletoe.
Loki eyed him for a moment, prodding the tip of the spear with his finger.
What an honor it was to build the tower for you, Ragnarok. To see the surprise in the eyes of gods who believed you nothing more than a passing event, to watch them suffer and then meet their demise in a sea of fire. Oh, what a delight it has been.
Loki snickered.
But you have forgotten something, Ragnarok.
Loki stopped toying with the spear and looked Ragnarok square in his fire-like eyes.
I am the trickster god.
Loki tossed the spear towards me and immediately wrapped his arms around Ragnarok. I kicked off the bone-covered ground and lunged for the spear. In a blink, I had snagged it from the air and thrust the sharpened tip towards Ragnarok. His grotesque face distorted into a look of utter betrayal. The spear stabbed into his chest, piercing through flesh and bone, through his cold, black heart, and with another forceful shove, came out the other side. I dropped to my feet as he collapsed amongst the litter of bones, impaled. He squirmed in agony. Blood filled his mouth. I crossed over to him and knelt, stared into his red eyes, dwindling suns. He looked back at me and tried to speak, but could only gurgle the pool of blood rising inside his torn mouth. I leaned closer and whispered, I can kill you with mistletoe too. His body went still. He lay dead upon blood and bone. The behemoth, an extension of his smaller self joined by an invisible tether, fell backward. We braced as he crashed to the ground, creating a thick cloud of bone dust. Beneath us shook violently. The giant quickly began to melt away and decay into gore, and then water. Blood of Ymir. Several quiet moments passed. No sound but the distant sizzling magma. I stared at the one the prophets referred to as the doom of the gods, and they were right. My father, mother, and brothers, all dead. For those who died in battle, Valhalla awaits. For the others, Helheim. It was later that I learned that as the tower sunk into the core, the gates opened. Thor fought his final battle with Jormungandr, the serpent, in the water-filled chamber. Odin faced Fenrir, the wolf. Neither were victorious in battle, but getting to Valhalla is its own kind of victory. There were, of course, prophecies relating to Ragnarok which were unfulfilled. Perhaps they are not so accurate after all, or maybe the tower was designed to change fate. Those who weave fate, Urd, Verdandi, and Skuld, bathed in blood in the chamber beneath the blind man. He was, in a way, the gatekeeper, the first face I saw when I entered the tower. What happens when fate dies? The blind man had not always been that way. In fact, as a god, he had the most remarkable eyesight of all. It was prophesied that during the events of Ragnarok, Heimdall and Loki would battle each other and kill each other. They would die side by side. That was the prophecy. That was Loki and Heimdall's fate. But as the tower was swallowed by fire, the Norns died. Fate died, and then lastly, Heimdall. I looked to Loki and nodded. A thank you, as much as one as I could give, and he nodded back.
I peered up at the insurmountable height above, a distant ceiling of flame, and muttered,
I'm sorry, Hannah.
Why are you sorry?
Asked Hell.
As a human, I was curious and stubborn, but I still loved her.
Your curiosity and stubbornness was the god in you.
I turned to Hell, and for the first time, she smiled.
You can be with her again,
she said.
How?
I asked. I had figured myself permanently imprisoned in the sweltering core.
If you travel to Helheim, I will release you, this time as you are.
How can I travel there from here?
Hell looked to Ragnarok's corpse, the spear in particular.
You must die once again.
I tensed as I remembered the first time. The stabbing pain, the cold, the dark, followed by years of forgetfulness. I thought a moment and said,
Okay.
But I must warn you,
said Hell.
Time passes more quickly while in Helheim.
Then you must release me quickly.
Hell nodded to Loki, who promptly yanked a spear from Ragnarok's corpse and stepped towards me. He looked at me, his expression, sorrow?
Do it,
I said, and for the second time, I died. It was an expensive house on a Florida beach. Squawking seagulls, salt air, crashing waves. I stepped onto the large front porch, a bench swing lightly swaying off to the side. I inhaled a deep breath and rang the doorbell. A beautiful woman in a floral sundress, blonde hair and blue eyes, sun-kissed skin, answered the door. She was startled at first glance and struggled to find words. Her cheeks reddened and her lips curled into a sheepish grin.
Can I help you?
She finally asked. I had stopped along the way and found something formal to wear, not overly fancy. A button-down shirt and dress pants, leather shoes. I made sure I was clean and presentable. I nabbed a gift bag along the way, a small present inside. Is Hannah home? The attractive young woman was confused by this.
Yeah, and you are?
A friend.
Right, a friend.
I smiled. A family member of Nate's. At the mention of Nate, her expression changed. She became saddened, apologetic.
Oh, wow. Okay, come on in.
I followed her into the foyer. Shoes of various sizes sat on the floor along the wall.
Let me go get her,
she said. Thank you. She hurried down the hall and rounded the corner into a separate room. A door slid open, letting in a symphony of beach noises. People, waves, birds. A moment passed and there was a patter of bare feet on wood. The young woman leaned into the hall.
Come on,
she said, waving me towards her with a welcoming smile. I joined her and stepped to the open sliding glass door. She pointed towards the beach.
She's sitting in that chair over there.
I smiled and said, thank you. Parked in the sand just off the immaculate back deck, facing the water, were two brightly colored Adirondack chairs, one blue, one green. A straw hat peaked just above the green chair. I crossed over to the chairs. Mind if I join you? I asked the sun hat. An older woman in her 80s turned to face me. She had a broad, friendly smile.
Please,
she said, motioning to the blue Adirondack, still smiling.
What's your name?
I hadn't thought of a name to use. Balder, I said, deciding it wouldn't make a difference. Her smile drooped a bit as I could see she was playing my name over in her head.
That's an interesting name. I think I've heard it before.
I'm sure you have.
Well, I'm Hannah.
I smiled. I know. She looked at me for a moment and said,
My granddaughter says you're related to my first husband.
I nodded. Yes. Her lip began to tremble, and her eyes started to water while she still tried to maintain her warm smile.
I'm sorry.
She apologized and dabbed her eyes with the towel she was sitting on. "It's okay," I said, tears beginning to swell in my own eyes.
I lost him 56 years ago.
She began.
That tower. Oh, you won't believe me. Nobody ever does.
"I'll believe you." She looked at me for a moment and continued.
He went into a tower we found while sailing in the North Atlantic. I tried for hours to get in and get to him, but I couldn't. I just kept pounding and pounding against it, yelling his name. I wasn't going to leave until he came out. But then it started to sink.
She glanced at me again, looking for clues that I wasn't buying into the story.
I contacted the Coast Guard. Anyone who would listen. Nobody ever found anything.
I picked up a shell off the sand and rubbed it between my fingers. "I'm sorry."
Oh,
Her voice quivered.
I'm sure that was long before you were born. Nothing you could have done. Probably not much anyone could have done back in 1965, to be fair. Technology just wasn't as good as it is now.
I nodded and leaned back in the chair. I watched playing children dive between the crashing waves and come up for air on the calmer side. "I tried to get to you sooner,"
Oh, did you?
Hannah said.
That's nice. And how are you related to Nate again?
I swallowed and looked back at her. "Just a cousin." Hannah smiled and turned to the ocean.
I never met any of his cousins.
Two small boys sprinted from the water towards us, kicking up sand behind them.
Nana! Nana!
They hollered and plopped their wet bodies into her lap.
You're getting water on me.
She shrieked and wrapped them in a towel. She tickled them through the fabric and the three of them burst into laughter. "Nana, how funny," I thought, as if it were fate.
What's that?
One of the boys asked, pointing at the gift bag sitting on the sand beside me. "Oh, just a gift."
For me?
Hannah asked, surprised. I looked at her for a moment. Her grandkids, the ocean. She had continued without Nate all those years ago, remarried, and had children and built a life worth living. She was happy. She was loved. "No," I lied. "It's for someone else,"
Oh,
said Hannah.
well, I hope they like it.
I gave a smile and a nod and stood. I should get going. "It's been a pleasure, Hannah."
Leaving already? You just got here.
"Yeah." I raised the gift bag to my shoulder and wiggled it as a playful reminder.
All right. Don't want to keep them waiting.
She gently took my hand and held it between both of hers, tender and appreciative. "I hope to see you again one day,"
That would be nice, Balder.
she responded, her face aglow with delight. She studied me an extra moment beneath the warm midday sun. The waves were beginning to calm and lap tranquilly against the shore. A soft smile formed on her aged face, and she said,
I can tell that you're related to Nate.
I exhaled a short, quivering breath and tilted my head, longing for a past never lived, and asked, "How?" She held my hand more tenderly, smiled more warmly, and said,
You have the same eyes.
Thanks so much again for watching this amazing tale. If you haven't checked out any of the voice narrators, please do so. Links to their channels will be listed in the description. Please show them some love. Also, another huge shout out and thanks to FishermanTales for allowing me to narrate this crazy epic story. And while you being here is more than enough support, I do not do this often. If you wish to show support in another manner, I do have links to my merch shop and buy me a coffee in the description. Please feel no obligation to actually do so. However, it is there if you'd like. Thank you all once again so much for the amazing support you continue to show. It's blown me away. But until next time, remember, just because you couldn't see it, doesn't mean it wasn't watching you.